The ECB this past week held its policy rate right at 2%, with policymakers out in force telling anyone who will listen they're done at that level. Instead, GDP numbers came out from all over the continent and showed there's more Pringles left to come in Europe. But there's also one factor that I don't think enough people are really considering, and that has to do with the 2% level itself and what that actually means. Now, what Christine Lagarde said, and she has said this repeatedly, is that the European economy and the ECB's policies are both in a very good place. She and others at the central bank have used the phrase so many times, rather than reinforce the intended message, it instead comes across as desperate. You know, like when you tell a big lie long enough, maybe people start to believe it. But that's what the GDP numbers, which were just released a few days ago, really showed. That Europe being in a good place absolutely is a bald-faced lie. On the contrary, and unambiguously, what the data shows is more macro pain ahead, which can only mean eventually more rate cuts out of the ECB, even if none of the European officials will say so right now. Their biggest hang-up, well, one of them, is how the central bank got to 2% much faster than anyone had been expecting, and what that means from the official perspective about how much room they might have left before they have to end up doing what none of them hope they end up having to do. Instead, they are desperately hoping the third quarter GDP estimate represented some shift to where the ECB won't have to do what we know they're going to do, because those output figures, on the contrary, conclusively show nothing has changed in Europe, and that there's more dangers to Europe and the global economy ahead. Europe's third quarter was another major bust. So, Steve, we had a bunch of central banks this past week. Let's start with the ECB, because I think the ECB in Europe is a very clear example of what we've been talking about all this time. They say the number is positive, therefore everything must be fine. We say just look at the charts, look at the context, look at the market reaction. Everything is not fine.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff, because you can say, hey, flat growth is great because it's positive, but tell that to the average consumer who's seen less hours and has more debt and their money isn't going as far. They're not feeling that flat is good. They need to see the economy growing because they need to see opportunity, because they continue to fall further and further behind. And we're seeing this across every major economy. Low income earners are just getting, slaughtered here. And everyone else says, well, it's just them. But no, the problem is it feeds back up. And slowly we're starting to see now white collar jobs are starting to go thanks to AI. And that's going to continue to feed upwards. And as more and more people start hitting the unemployment line in every major economy, flat growth is bad growth, because it means there's no jobs for these people to go get and continue to be productive members of the society and spend and consume, which is what we need. It's just not happening.
Yeah, that's what we heard this week, too, from a bunch of companies like Chipotle and Heinz Kraft, as I talked about in the video. They both said the same thing. They say, look, our customers are saying we can't afford price increases. We can't actually afford to come to your restaurants in the same way that we used to before. And while everybody says that's inflation, it's actually not inflation. It's what Steve just said. It's a lack of economic growth. We could afford price changes. Even the worse off among us could afford price changes if there was legitimate economic growth as well as income growth. That's what's missing here. So when you see flat GDP, what that says is the economy is not growing enough to generate nearly enough income to absorb any amount of price changes, let alone an accelerated schedule of them. That's what we're seeing is the absolute best example across Europe. But it's not just Europe. It's happening here in the US and everywhere else. That's what we keep getting over and over again. And so just from strictly an interest rate and financial standpoint, we all know how this is going to play out, because how do central bankers react to a situation? They say it's getting better, but over time, what we see is that it actually is getting worse. People are falling further and further and further behind. And so just from a purely financial standpoint, how do central bankers react to that? In the same way they always do. They say, well, we're worried about inflation, but we're going to cut rates anyway. And then they cut rates and say, well, we're done cutting rates because we don't see negative GDP numbers. And then, maybe 6 months later, what do? Well, they cut rates again because nothing has actually changed or improved. These rate cutting cycles are irregular for this reason. They're even more irregular in this cycle simply because the growth isn't there, but it doesn't look like a recession. So central bankers are confused. The financial media is confused. Everybody's confused. So just go buy some stocks. In a world where markets swing on every headline, focus matters. That's why Eurodollar University offers its one big weekly theme, a disciplined thematic analysis that you can count on. If you don't have time to go all the way to the depth of Eurodollar University's comprehensive deep dive analysis, but you want to get the next best thing, One Big Weekly Theme is for you. Each week, we pick the one high-impact macro and market theme, and we unpack it from first principles, from fundamentals to real-world implications, so you can see the forest and the trees, drawing from all over the vast Eurodollar University library and canon. What you get with One Big Weekly Theme is a single focused theme each week, unpacked with clarity from sources you will not see anywhere else. Data-driven analysis, supported by charts and information pulled from Eurodollar University's other subscriptions and offerings, all in a simple, repeatable framework you'll use week after week. We distill the complexity into a practical, fundamentals-first playbook that you can rely on. This is not about chasing every hot idea. It's about building a disciplined routine that sharpens your judgment during these periods of uncertainty. So if you're ready to make your week count, subscribe to One Big Weekly Theme today. Visit eurodollaruniversity.substack.com or click the link in the description to learn more. You can sample the service or sign up and get started straight away. Eurodollar University, a focused approach to mastering money and macro, one thoughtful week at a time.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jeff, there's only one place there's no confusion. Rate cuts, buy stocks, of course. And again, you come back to these low-income households. I mean, particularly here in the U.S., and we could see this coming earlier this year when there were a lot of student loan borrowers who started going into delinquency. So they were seeing financial stress at the beginning of the year. And based on the clock, toward the end of the year, they would go into default. And under the new policies, that means if you have a job, there's going to be forced payback. And regardless, if you're getting a tax refund next year, well, that's all going to go to pay your debt too. So you look and you see just this confluence of events that's happening for these low-income people. And we've been waiting for this. And that's why you said this Chipotle thing was perfect, because if people can't afford a $12 burrito, it's a major warning sign for the rest of the economy. And so again, as we look at the federal funds rate or any policy rate for that matter, how does a drop in interest rates help low-income people? Are they going to be able to refi their debt? No, not really. Is it going to create a job for them? No, because businesses don't create jobs based on rate cuts. Is it going to increase consumption? Well, maybe arguably for people who need to borrow a lot of money and spend, but is it enough to drive the entire economy? And the answer is no, which is obvious why when central banks start cutting rates, as your Pringles can suggest, they don't stop.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. It's not about does it actually help people, right? It's about, do you feel better? Do you feel like the Federal Reserve is helping you out? Do you feel like the ECB is helping you out? What the ECB has said is that we have dropped our rates so low that they are in a good place. And the good place means that it somehow supports the economy. You're not supposed to ask why or how does this work? How does this help me? You're just supposed to accept that low interest rates from the ECB somehow filters its way through this invisible hand of Adam Smith and ends up in your pocketbook somehow. So you know that it's going to be better down the road. So why not go out and spend today, because things are picking up. The ECB has seen to it with its good place policies, or the Federal Reserve is cutting rates now and being supportive on the economy. So go out and spend. Things are going to be better down the road. That's certainly the effect that interest rate policies have in the stock market. It's basically sentimental. If you think the Fed is helping you, then if you have the ability to act in a way that you think the Fed is helping you, then you can. And it's the easiest thing to do in stocks. Not so easy in the economy, because you can't just go out and start spending if you don't really have any solid idea that you're going to have the income or a job to pay for it. There's so much more friction in the real economy, but you're not supposed to ask these questions. You're supposed to just say GDP is positive, interest rates are supportive, and everything is just great right down the middle.
So this is a big challenge, as we head into the final stages of the year, going into next year. If we look at holiday spending, if it comes in weak and everything at this point says, yeah, it's not just consumers saying they're not going to spend, the economy saying they don't have the money to spend. So you look at that, we're accelerating layoffs going into the end of the year. Rate cuts at this point aren't going to move the needle. I mean, we just recently saw the Dallas Fed services sector or retail sector, and they said, look, inventory levels didn't go down despite a huge drop in sales. So the issue still is way too much inventory, Jeff, and rate cuts aren't fixing that.
Yeah, and it's also, like you said, when you listen to consumers themselves, they continuously say the same thing. They said the same thing all year. And I think what is particularly important about it, and maybe even a little bit dangerous, and I've pointed this out a couple of times before, and I know you have too, Steve, is that consumer sentiment usually, I mean, not perfectly, but it usually aligns with the stock market, because people get their perceptions of how the economy is doing from Wall Street. And it kind of makes intuitive sense, even though there's no relationship between stock prices and the economy anyway. But people's perceptions do come from the stock. I mean, it's what you're told from the very beginning. The stock market is discounting fundamental information about macroeconomics, and therefore the stock market is the best picture of how the economy is doing. That's all bull. We know that's bull, but most people don't. And so they accept the idea that stocks are somehow a really true representation of how things are going. So if stocks are soaring, people are generally thinking, okay, I don't see it in my life. My neighbors are bitching and everybody else is unhappy, but somebody must be doing well because Wall Street is soaring. So you usually see a pretty good relationship between the stock market and consumer sentiment. And that held up this year too. Consumer sentiment plunged earlier in the year. It wasn't an overreaction to tariffs. It wasn't really tariffs at all. A lot of it was macroeconomic uncertainty, but also the stock market started to plunge. And everybody said, oh no, oh crap, this must mean things are really going bad. And then the stock market rebounded on politics, non-economics, and sentiment started to recover a little bit. But somewhere along the way, in the middle of this year, they diverged. The stock market kept going, especially in AI and the tech bubble. That kept flying, but consumers stopped paying attention to stocks. They started saying, wait a minute, what's Wall Street doing? Because I see something else. And so that divergence between consumer confidence and the equity market is telling you that something big broke in the economy that grabbed consumers' attention and said, stop looking at, NVIDIA and AI and Bitcoin and start looking over here at your actual personal situation, because this stuff is not happening over here in reality.
Yeah, but Jeff, and that's exactly what was showing up in the PMIs, the Fed surveys, the consumer confidence surveys was, you can just see workers going in, for the day and finding out, hey, what do I have to do? And it's like, oh, there's not that many new orders. And boss says, great, we'll go in the back and dig up some of those backlogs and work on that. And they go in the back and, oh, well, it's not a whole lot of that either. They check and see, is a fax machine worrying for some export orders? No, that's not really doing much either. And then they start to have the realization that it doesn't matter if the stock market's up, my hours are going to get cut, and inflation is still running too hot, despite Powell's claim that it's cooling off. It's like, okay, maybe it is, but the reality is for the average American household, it's not, because their hours and their wages aren't keeping pace. So again, we come back to the real issue here from earlier this year, and consumers nailed it because they were seeing it in real time. And that was, as you said, they were looking at the stock market and going, huge disconnect.
Yeah, so you list all of these things, right? I mean, not what even the Fed's interest rates to an extent, or the ECB, or whatever their policy rates, but you list all these things, and they are all symptoms of an unhealthy economy, right? That's consumer confidence that diverges from stock market. That's not a good sign of something, right? As Steve said, the fax machine isn't whirring. Backlogs are being worked down, including in the services sector. Service economy providers are saying, we're struggling here. Chipotle can't sell as many burritos as they were before. These are all signs of an unhealthy economy, which all brings us back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is this confusion over the economic situation simply because GDP tends to be positive more often than not. Just being positive does not indicate a healthy economy. And that's what we're really saying here, is that the GDP, when you actually stop and look at it, and Europe is the best example of this, and there's economic accounts throughout the world. The US labor market statistics are another really good example of this too, that forgot how to grow dynamic. And so all of these things that we keep listing off are symptoms of an unhealthy economy, which is in many ways really well represented by GDP that goes sideways. So sure, it's positive, but that doesn't actually matter. It's not actually meaningful. And so when you have all of these, you have an unhealthy economic situation. Again, bringing this back to the financial context, we know what happens to interest rates in an unhealthy economic situation. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not in a straight line. And even central bankers are going to push back here and there. This is, the crux of Jay Powell's argument on Wednesday was, look, there are people on the FOMC who said, yeah, we see the negative payroll report. We saw ADP. They used to get ADP's weekly numbers before everybody else did. We saw all that information, but we're still not convinced it means it's the worst possible case. And so even over time, central bankers, whether they want to or not, because this situation is unhealthy and it continues to get even more unhealthy. And as Steve said, consumers in particular at the bottom ends of the spectrum get further and further and further behind. And by the way, they know it, which is one reason why socialism is so popular, why political disaffection is everywhere. You can find it everywhere. They know they're being left behind. And so you get all of these symptoms from every part of life that suggest the economy is unhealthy. And yet You have officials telling you completely the opposite. Oh, GDP was up 0.2% across Europe. We're doing a really good job. The economy's in a good place.
Yeah, Jeff, and there's some problems because you can get some artificial boost to these numbers, particularly as you know, inventory building. I mean, that doesn't really help with consumption, but you can make your GDP numbers look good. And there's another false positive we got. You know, you look at all the front running of the tariffs. You know, retail sales jump, and that really does give policymakers some hope that. And we heard them say, "Oh, look, consumers are absorbing higher prices; they can afford this." And we're not really sure that we didn't think they could, but wow, look at them going. And businesses were like, "Oh, hallelujah! I need to raise prices some more." And then all of a sudden, and you and I had been waiting for this day to see when does this stop. And then when Chipotle's announcement came out and said, "Hey, people can't afford a burrito," it's really a shock that that air pocket that you've been talking about and we've discussed many times, we're starting now to see the beginning stages of that really show up in the consumer spending habits. That is the big problem here, because once consumers are saying, look, I'm out of money, it is game over.
Yeah, the artificial stuff. I mean, you go to look for example, Canada. The Bank of Canada said when all of the artificial stuff was taking place, they said that was us. That was the rate cut. See, we're doing our job. And so the Bank of Canada said we don't need to cut rates anymore. We're going to stick here at 2.75%. The economy's in good shape. It's weathering all these tariff storms and all the other headwinds that we've been talking about. We're done. We don't need to do any more rate cuts. Congratulate us. Where's the parade? And then what happened? You got a little bit further away from all that artificial stuff. You started to see the payback emerge. Canada put up an absolutely atrocious second quarter as far as GDP is concerned. They started losing tens of thousands of jobs per month. And suddenly, what does the Bank of Canada do? They start reducing interest rates all over again. It doesn't happen in a straight line, but eventually they're forced into that mode because the economy is unhealthy. All of these symptoms continue to add up to that one thing over and over again. It's that everywhere you look, okay, it doesn't necessarily look like a recession that everybody has in their mind. It's not the second half of 2008 and the first half of 2009, but it is still a recession nonetheless. That's why we call it forgot how to grow. And we have all the evidence for it up to including GDP. And so again, from a financial context, we know how central banks are going to respond to this. It's just that they're not going to do it all at once. So basically, what we got from GDP in Europe explains everything that we saw from central banks this week, including the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, for all their bluster about not wanting to commit to a rate cut in December, and for all they're saying, well, we're not sure the economy is really that weak, what did they do anyway? They voted to cut rates anyway, because deep down they know the economy is not healthy.
Yeah, exactly, Jeff. And that's why it's all about now forward guidance from the Fed, because they know that a recession is happening. There's no question that they know it. But if they come out and say, look, we're going to do all these things at once and we're going to keep cutting, that's why they're going to say, this is the last cut. And you're hearing this from every central bank. The last one was the last one. Don't count on another one. Because the moment they say, look, we think things are bad and we're going to have to cut, and we're going to have to cut a whole lot more. Now you risk taking that small percentage of the population that's driving all of the real economic growth here, and they start to panic. And the word gets out, there's going to be a recession. Spending will get cut. Stocks will get sold off. And the next thing you know, you've got a recession. And that's the problem with the Fed is it's all about messaging now. They can't admit the truth because, well, once they do, everyone's going to respond to it in the worst possible way.
That's one of the big sticking points about 2%, right, Steve? The Fed's got a little bit ways to go, and so they're going to pretend, we don't need to get down to 2%. But like the ECB or the Bank of Canada now, the Bank of Canada is butting up against 2%. The ECB is right at 2%, and it's exactly what you just said. They don't want to go below 2% because 2% they've categorized as, that's ultra low or historically low territory, and so you don't, it's sort of like break glass in case of emergency. They know if they go below 2%, that sends an immediate signal things are not good. So they're going to stop around 2% and say, we don't need to go any lower, not because they actually believe it in many cases, but because they know if they go below 2%, they are actually breaking the glass. It does signal emergency. So there is a tremendous amount of just, symbolic resistance to going that far down. And we should also recognize how the fact that a lot of these central banks are already that far down. They're already in that level to begin with. So there's extra resistance to doing any more to it. So we're not surprised by the fact that central banks come out and say, we're going to pause here, because they are going to pause here as much as they possibly can. But in the end of the day, what the GDP numbers show, and Mexico's another one, Mexico GDP fell 0.3% during the third quarter, which suggests that Mexico is actually heading toward a recognizable NBER style recession. So you've got Europe that continues to forget how to grow. We've got Mexico that goes into recession. You've got China. I mean, we haven't even talked about China. China is a complete mess that's getting worse. And you have all of these, the labor market in the US. It's, as I keep saying, we keep coming back to the same thing. The global economy is unhealthy, and we get all these signs of ill health, including central banks, who, despite all of the any kind of rational, honest analysis, refuse to do anything other than say, hey, everything is just fine. Huge thanks to Steve Van Meter for stopping by. You got to check out what's happening in the repo market, especially what we can see of it with the Fed's repo facility. Huge escalation in that this past week. Video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.